Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to invite Scott to introduce our guest this evening and presenter, Chris Edwards. Scott, would you like to do so, as you are a close contact of Chris?
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, my very great pleasure to introduce Chris Edwards. He's the Managing Director of Go Logistics, a logistics business based in Auckland. He is also President of the Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders Federation. And it is with that hat on, he's been going around the country recently talking to all sorts of businesses about the state of play. And I had a catch up with Chris, I don't know, probably 6-8 weeks ago now, and I found it really, really enlightening. Getting Chris's perspective on where things are at in terms of trade, freight, logistics, both nationally and internationally, and the state of where things are today and where they could be heading. And so I asked Chris if he would be open to talking to the group. So we have here, Chris, today some of the other TAB business coaches, plus some business owners from all within New Zealand. Yeah, and we'd really appreciate hearing some of your thoughts on those topics. And then if we had some questions at the end from the floor, that would be great as well. And I know how you are. You're very open, very transparent, and you say it as you see it. So that's fantastic. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Chris. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Gentlemen and ladies, how are we all this evening? If you're working in my industry, you're not looking too good today, because you would have heard the announcement that the stevedores in Australia are going on strike from next week, just when things couldn't get particularly worse in the supply chain. They just did today. So rolling strikes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the majority of vessels that come to New Zealand call through Australia on the way here. So if we had problems before, they have just got worse today. Now, whether it's brinkmanship from the union or whether this is going to proceed, none of us really know, but we're all planning for it. When I woke up this morning and checked my Reuters feed, my main concern was the problems with the ports in China. There's been all sorts of issues with those ports between COVID, energy, some ports being closed, all sorts of things. We also have a thing called Golden Week starting on the 1st of October, which is a week-long holiday. So traditionally, freight forwarders like me rush to get goods to ports and airports, because then after a week, nothing happens. But this week, that will be quite a challenge, as a number of the ports are closed for all sorts of reasons as well. So I'm sure within your own client bases and groups you mix with, the supply chain is probably the most popular topic at the moment, aside from COVID, in discussions that you have with people. And I really hope that a year on from when these problems started, we'd be in a much better and stronger position, but actually we're not. And in fact, we're probably staring down the barrel of another year before this gets resolved. They say that misery loves company. It could be worse. You could be in America. The American supply chain is completely broken. And to put things in context, if you are an importer from America at the moment, you won't see a vessel leave now before the end of November, potentially December, to New Zealand. It is in such a mess, the States. The thing is, the situation that's caused all this hasn't really changed in New Zealand. We've got the problem with the ports of Auckland, the problem with congestion around the world. But I guess what has changed is the cost of that congestion and the cost of bringing goods to New Zealand and exporting them as well. That goes up either month on month or quarter by quarter. And while it may have peaked in some people's minds, we also understand today that the Maersk Group are going to raise rates again on the 1st of October from Europe into New Zealand by a quantum of around 70%. So again, to put that in perspective, Maersk have also advised the Danish stock market that they're going to bank the biggest profit in the history of Danish corporations this year. So they're going well, depending which side of the fence you sit at, I guess. But I think the most frustrating thing for New Zealand exporters and importers at the moment is the unreliability of schedules, the inability to plan because things keep changing, and the significant congestion in the supply chain from many, many quarters, leading to significant costs and delays. Adding another element this week was the problems from Tauranga back up to Auckland. they're now back out to 2 weeks on average to bring a rail wagon from Tauranga to Auckland with containers on it. So you can imagine you've waited 4 or 6 weeks perhaps to get a container into Tauranga, and then a further 2 weeks before it appears at a railhead in Auckland if you're relying on Kiwi Rail, who are swamped as well. So in terms of good news, there isn't a lot. I suppose the only thing I would say is that we do have a small disruptor arriving into the market in the shape of a Taiwanese-owned company called TS Lines. TS Lines start with container services to New Zealand in October, and by November, they will be on a weekly service into this country. And I can tell you the first 2 sailings are fully booked because companies like mine have taken every slot we possibly can to try and relieve some of the backlogs and congestion that are coming to New Zealand at the moment. There's strong rumours of another bigger disruptor coming, but nothing is confirmed yet. And until it is, we'd be reluctant to talk about it. But I do know that this other shipping line is a big company, and they're in talks with 2 of the biggest ports in New Zealand to see if they can get a service started up. But I guess to conclude what I'm going to say tonight, a lot of the stuff I've talked about is in the media, and we've done a pretty good job in our industry to get supply chain issues front and centre for New Zealand importers, and perhaps more importantly, New Zealand exporters, the middle end of the street who can't get their goods out to market. What we found in the last 12 to 16 months is that one size doesn't fit all. You've got the big end of town, the Zesprys, the Fonterras of the world. They're still okay. They've got fairly significant contracts with shipping lines, and they can still move containers with some restriction. And again, to put that in context, Kotahi/Fonterra have actually moved more containers in the past 12 months than they did in the previous 12. But they're in the minority. They're in the top 30 exporters. The middle part of town, a lot of my clients would sit in that category, are seeing their sweat equity eroded more and more as they can't get goods to market. They're frustrated, they've been to government, they look for help and assistance, but from what we can see at the moment, there isn't any coming. And they're in a very difficult predicament because as the rest of the world begins to open up, as they can't reach markets because of congestion or lack of shipping options, they're losing market share. And that is disastrous to some of the clients who spend a lot of time building up those markets, particularly now as they can't travel, yet at least, to go and service those accounts in that last 10% of the handshake and getting deals done. So it's a pretty difficult position for exporters at the moment. And most of the inquiries I get on behalf of the industry are from medium-sized exporters wanting to know when the situation will change. Again, there's no easy answer there either. And I don't think it will be in the next 6 to 8 months. So I guess to conclude my brief discussion tonight, supply chain issues and problems will be with us for at least another 12 to 18 months. And even though there are new vessels being built, I suspect we'll be one of the last parts of the world to see them. Those big ships will go into the bigger trade lanes between China and Europe and China and the United States, mainly because the freight rates are higher. Now, you could argue those trade lanes are significantly congested, and so it won't be easy for ships to go back and forth. But I think that's where it'll head for the moment anyway. And just to put that congestion into context also, you would have seen, I'm sure, on the news, there's around 60 container vessels parked outside Long Beach and Los Angeles. But perhaps what you're not seeing, there's around 30 or 40 outside Savannah in Georgia and New York and New Jersey as well. So the United States in particular has got real problems in terms of clearing what is significant demand. Some studies I've read suggest it's because we're in the just-in-case supply chain now, where instead of ordering a couple of containers, you'll order maybe 15 or 20 to hold the stock. And that's leading to significant congestion and volume issues as well. That is probably partly true. You've got other problems like we have in this country of a lack of truck drivers, problems with rolling stock on trains, and particularly in the West Coast, reasonably high absenteeism from ports as workers don't turn up to work for a whole lot of reasons, COVID being one of them, I guess. So there's a fair bit of, to use the terrible euphemism, challenge in the market at the moment. And as I said to Scott at a coffee, goodness, 6 weeks ago now, I guess, Scott, given the level changes, this problem is going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. I'd like to invite any...
I guess... sorry, yes.
Sorry, Chris, I thought you were concluding there. You carry on.
I have. No,
okay.
you're fine.
Very good. Well, thank you for that. If you've got a question, perhaps you can just indicate it in the chat box, or just put your hand up. I'll kick things off if you don't mind. I love the way just in time has become just in case. I appreciated that subtlety there. But in context, can you give us an understanding of the number of players that operate in New Zealand? You mentioned TS lines out of Taiwan might be a disruptor and possibly another big one. But what's the market like at the moment? Is it like our supermarkets, a duopoly? Is it an oligopoly? How many players are there of significance?
It's not quite a duopoly, but we have what we call consortiums. And consortiums in the shipping industry mean 3 or 4 shipping lines working together, sharing slots on differing vessels. And that's what's really changed, I guess, in the last 10 years or so. There might have been 10 to 15 different shipping lines coming to New Zealand at the beginning of the 2000s. That has significantly reduced. So realistically, you probably players coming in and out of the market. And I think because we are the Stewart Island of the supply chain, we're at the very end of the world, there's got to be a good reason to come here. Typically, that's been our exports. But the export guys have got together under a brand called Kotahi, which pools their freight volumes. And they've done some fairly significant negotiating, both with the Port of Tauranga and also Maersk and Maersk's other sub-brands. So again, in terms of options to this country, we are fairly restricted compared to other countries, even compared to Australia, which has a few more players. We're also constricted in that our port policy really only has 2 or 3 ports of call for bigger vessels. So you're left with a very regional port approach as well, which hasn't worked well in these climates, as we have no coastal shipping industry anymore, except one vessel. So options, I guess, are quite limited, Stephen, in that case.
Thank you for that clarification, Chris. So let's throw it open now. Has anyone got any areas they would like to ask a question on? Alfredo, go ahead.
Yeah, I was writing it in the chat, but so thank you for all the explanation. I have one question. So you say that probably will take up to 1 year or maybe more to recover the situation. Do you think it's going to worsen, really?
I think it does. I mean, Alfredo, at the moment, schedule reliability sits under 10% to this country. So in every 10 vessels, only 1 will be coming on time. Even that's potentially marginal. So I think the problem will remain pretty bad. And I think even when it starts to rectify itself, there'll be 2 sides to the coin. Maybe more capacity, which will be welcome for importers and exporters. But what about the cost? I mean, as we've seen, the cost is at historically high margin and rates. I don't think that cost is going to come down to pre-2019 levels for a long time. I think potentially 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer. In the old days, more capacity meant lower freight rates. But I think this time around, the shipping lines will hold their ground and keep rates high. So a good news, bad news story potentially for importers and exporters.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. Let's go to Chris Deere now. And then there's a question from Kevin in the chat box. Chris?
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned, you know, how with the containers coming into New Zealand with imported goods and then typically going out with exports, and you mentioned the challenges around exporters getting their goods to market. Do you see the same sort of pain and challenge existing for those importing products, not exporters, but importing into New Zealand?
Good question, Chris. I think there's 2 parts again to that discussion. Let's talk about the exports to begin with. The shipping lines are preferring to take empty containers over full exports at the moment because they want to take those containers back to white-hot markets. And that's quite a problem for the exporting community, not just in New Zealand, but other parts of the world. I think the difference is in other parts of the world, there's a government agency such as the FMC or in Australia's KCA CCC that are involved in this discussion and trying to force the lines to take exported goods back out of the country rather than just turn around with empty containers. But I think the other thing for New Zealand, which is a little unusual, is that the export freight rates are significantly less than the import ones. So the 2 markets haven't really caught up yet. So importers, on the other hand, they're in a spot market auction type of arrangement now, Chris, where whoever pays the highest price tends to get on board the vessel. It's a spot rate market. So a company like mine, it might bring in between 15 to 20,000 containers a year. We have contracts with the shipping lines, but those contracts are pretty useless at the moment as the market turns to a winner takes all, highest bid wins type approach. For example, we've got a booking this week of 10 containers coming from a port called Nansha. Only 2 were loaded contract. The rest are coming on spot. And I see that becoming a problem, well, remaining a problem for quite a while. Highest price wins, and on you go.
Thank you, Chris. Let's go to Kevin now. Kevin, can you just give us context to your question, please, around air freight capacity to Australia, in particular West Australia? Why is that of interest to you?
Okay, so we export to Western Australia, but most of it's quite small stuff. So we tend to use air freight. So I just wanted to understand constraint now and in the future, for that sort of.
Good question, Kevin, because I guess when you think about it, pre-COVID, we were quite an unusual country in that our tourism was such a draw. We had 20 plus airlines coming here. You know, for a small country, that's quite unusual. But with that all ending, now we're in a very difficult situation where you've got Air New Zealand, Airwork are running a couple of charters for FedEx, and DHL being the only carriers currently going trans-Tasman. So you take Perth as an example. So I also do quite a bit of business in Perth myself. To get something out of New Zealand into Perth is very difficult currently. You're going via another city or a Brisbane, maybe an Adelaide, and then connecting domestically. The thing that changes that probably is government policy around border openings, because that means more options coming here. And we've seen in Australia, at least, a lot of airlines have announced returning to Australia in December. So Air Canada, there's quite a number have broadcast that out. Until New Zealand joins that list, I guess, of changing its policy on tourism and or COVID, it'll be challenging for a bit longer yet, I would think. But certainly by the first quarter of next year, I expect to see more options.
Right, thanks.
Okay, any further questions for Chris? Scott, go ahead, and then we'll go to Steve.
Yeah, Chris, when we talked, you discussed about shipping coming from Australia and maybe having more direct lines to and fro. Have you sort of advanced your thinking, or
and again,
anything further to discuss around that?
I've been to Michael Wood, the Minister for Transport, to discuss this idea of hub and spoken with Australia. And ironically, I see today the Port of Newcastle, which is one of the ports we suggested, is just talking about enlarging its footprint to allow for more containers and larger vessels. We kind of think that because we are at the end of the world, we are the Stewart Island of the supply chain, a lot of the bigger lines, by the time they get even to Australia, have been significantly delayed. And some, I feel, don't particularly want to come here. And if they do want to come here, it's one port only, as opposed to the 10 or 12 regional ports we currently have. So the middle part of town, the SMEs and the middle-sized businesses, and they need an answer to control the narrative. We can't tell the bigger lines what to do and when to come, but if we had a hub and spoke model potentially that took containers from New Zealand, took them to a bigger Australian port, and then fed the world from there, I think that's an idea perhaps worth pursuing. And as I said when we met for coffee, Scott, I worry we're going to waste this crisis, because this has taught us a lot of things about our supply chain and how fragile it is and how much we rely on bigger companies, I guess, for want of a better word, to do the right thing. I don't think that's the case, and I think we need to have a few different ideas. You could argue maybe KiwiRail is a vehicle for that, or some private enterprise. And I note that Main Freight, who are obviously a big player, they have been in talks with some of the, we call reefer charterers, to bring containers back down to New Zealand. But it certainly needs something different to what we currently have, in my opinion.
Thank you, Scott. And Chris, let's go to Steve.
Unmute. Oh, hi. I've got 2 questions. I think you've answered pretty much. My first one was around about, I've seen our import costs rise by over 500% or so in the last 18 months. And I think you indicated that, hey, that still could look to increase.
It depends on the line. I mean, you've got the French guys, CMA, CGM, going to market and saying they've capped rate increases until the 1st of February. Now, the cynics are amongst us will think, well, they're so high anyway, really, what have you announced to the market? But I guess there is some comfort in that. But Maersk and Hamburg Süd and those guys, yeah, they've announced another increase again. So it just seems when demand is so hot, Steve, I guess they can, because people will continue to pay. The thing that fixes this in a lot of respects is a lack of demand. And that's really what will come down to change some of the environment, I guess.
Okay. And the other thing, I've just been hit up recently where first time where we had to pay a few $100 for extra container storage in Auckland because it ran out of space for storage of containers, empty ones.
Yeah, it's outrageous, isn't it? Container detention. And again, we've been to the Minister about this. On behalf of us, the Minister wrote to the shipping lines and saying, when your empty container depots are full, it is unreasonable to charge container detention. Now, of the 7 lines or consortiums he wrote to, 3 have come back and said, fair enough, we won't. And the other 4 said, too bad, we've got costs too, you have to cover it. And I think it's a very unpleasant part of the shipping industry at the moment, where the common sense perhaps is left at the door. I've been to the disputes tribunal 3 times so far this year around container detention, chunky amounts, $10,000 to $15,000, when clients couldn't return containers to empty depots that were full. And we've won every case based on the balance of fairness. But to have to do it and do the admin part of it, it's a pain, frankly speaking. I don't know why common sense doesn't apply, but here we are.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, I've got another question, Chris, if I may. I don't see any hands going up. So you talked about a hub and spoke arrangement between Australia and New Zealand, and you also mentioned that our coastal shipping is woefully undersupplied. Could you envisage in the future a hub and spoke arrangement existing within New Zealand where maybe only 1 or 2 ports are served by the big carriers and we have a much bigger coastal fleet? Or is that unlikely?
No, I think it's very likely, and I think the shipping lines will make that decision for us, Steve, to be honest. I mean, government policy around port policies had report after report, many millions spent and not a lot achieved. But the truth is, the big shipping lines, I think, will choose probably 2 ports in this country. I suspect Tauranga and Littleton, and feed their containers in there. If that does happen, we're going to need a more robust coastal model. There is a coastal vessel run by Pacifica currently around the coast, but it's fully booked and you won't get on board unless you're a big player. There have been some market surveys done about how many other vessels we would need. It looks like the answer sits between 1 and 2 of a decent size, just to keep feeding the coast and getting containers put where they needed to be. There's a thing we call container tourism in our industry, where a container arrives at a port and has to make its way to its actual destination on another vessel. Again, that's something that we're going to have to consider in terms of our flow. But I think there's also an ideological position going on here as well. So I've been to select committees on Zoom with ministers, etc., discussing coastal shipping and those sorts of things. I think the thing that'll get it over the line is not the supply chain, but the greening of the supply chain. Government sees coastal shipping as an answer to carbon footprints, and I think that's what will get it over the line, perhaps sooner than later.
Presumably with electric ships then.
I think, well, again, if you look at Maersk, they've signaled that biofuel is the answer to the future. And the weird thing, or perhaps the interesting thing, perhaps, all the other shipping lines have gone and built a whole lot of more vessels. They've got orders in place and that sort of stuff. But the Maersk haven't done that. And we think the strategy behind Maersk's thinking is, well, they're going to really push the biofuels and the methanol side of things and almost change their marketing strategy compared to the other lines who are still building traditional vessels. So yeah, that whole carbon footprint part is going to be important in shipping, whether we like it or not. It's coming and we have to get used to it.
And Tauranga over Auckland, is that a matter of having to get around the Coromandel?
The thing about Tauranga, I guess there's a few things about Tauranga. I feel sorry for them in that they've had to do a big amount of work because obviously Auckland has not been functioning as it should have done. What is sad to see is that Tauranga had a number of, I guess, shovel-ready projects that could have gone ahead to relieve some of the congestion, but were denied by government and referred back to the Environment Court. But I think we've also seen, Stephen, that the ports of Auckland, now past its anniversary of its automation problems, have really caused a significant problem in this country. And until that comes right, I just don't see an easy solution. And we need the ports of Auckland to be functioning properly. You can't have a situation where a shipping line comes in and it's not sure when it's going to be unloaded. It can't function that way.
Thank you, Chris. Kevin, I see your hand went up and then we go to Scott.
Yep. I've got to leave the discussion now. I'm sitting in a virtual lobby, which is about to open in a minute. So just a thank you. That was really informative, Chris. And also a big thank you to Gavin Powell, one of your guys who sends out a regular weekly email. Very informative. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we tried to make that an op-ed, Kev, rather than just be boring. So I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. See you guys. Thank you.
See you, Kevin.
Cheers.
Okay, Scott.
You brought up the thorny issue of Auckland Port. So, can we just dive a bit deeper on kind of where that's at and, resolution, timing?
Well, I think it speaks volumes. They haven't got a new CEO yet, right? And I'm guessing that CEO role is a poison chalice. And I don't know. Again, the ports of Auckland, I don't want to beat up on the port because there's some good people there, but they've given, I guess, indication to the market their automation project will be finished by the end of their financial year, which is June next year. That's still a long way away. And they can't reinstate what we call berthing windows. In other words, ship turns up and gets unloaded on time until that automation project is finished. So I guess the sincere hope is that automation is completed, the port is a safer place to operate if you're a stevedore or a lasher, and they get back into a 7-day-a-week operation where all cranes, or at least the majority of them, are running smoothly, like we had 2018-esque. I've seen some reports about the port saying that regardless of COVID, this would have been an issue because of the way they've done their labour and their planning. I'm not sure if that's true, Scott, but it's an unusual situation. It's one that needs to be taken care of and get resolved as soon as possible.
Thank you, Chris. Looking around, any other questions from anyone? Alfredo?
Just a thought. It's a broad, open question, but well, I've read and I've heard a lot about local producing, local consuming, since COVID. But it seems that it's not working. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, Alfredo. I guess to be a local manufacturer, it's not easy to scale up quickly. It will take some time, I presume, for a local industry to get started. But I also think we're dealing potentially, this is a personal opinion, with Kiwi culture. Kiwi culture traditionally has been, let's get it as cheap as we possibly can and pay as little as we can for it as well. And the answer to that probably lies in places like China and Vietnam rather than local manufacturer here. So I think there's a balance. I think there's a lot of frustration about supply chain issues into this country, but I don't think people can scale up easily to become manufacturers, depending on the commodity, of course. That will make a difference.
And globally, shouldn't it improve all the shipping constraints if they concentrate on that?
I think globally there is, in some quarters, an anti-globalization feeling, and I think a desire to bring manufacturing home to certain countries. Again, there's probably a more political answer to that than an economic one. But ultimately, I think, particularly where we are in this part of the world, we're going to still be a significant importing country. I mean, you would have seen the balance of payments. They're well out of whack now, imports versus exports. America's even worse. It used to be, for example, at the Port of Long Beach, exports would dominate imports. Now it's completely reversed. And I can understand why. There's no travel in the States. We're only up until November before it starts again. People are buying consumer goods and imports are dominating and dominating strongly.
Thank you, Chris. Peter, I noticed your hand went up.
Yeah. Look, one of the issues that we've found, we're importing containers, not huge numbers, but we're up to max weight, 22 tonne in a 20-foot container. And so at the moment, we've got, say, one sitting in Singapore not getting loaded because obviously they can ship 3 containers that may add up to the same gross weight and make 3 times the amount of money.
Well, it's not even that, Peter. It's just as soon as you've got something difficult, like an overweight container, a container with a hazmat in it, an open top container, anything outside the norm, you're getting left behind. You shouldn't be, but you are, because it's easier for them to load it. Normal general container, weight regardless. It just makes things simple for them. Singapore also, Peter, is a significant problem anyway. We're seeing delays of sort of 4 to 6 weeks as a transship hub now. We've moved a lot of our volume out of Singapore into Hong Kong just to try and beat that. So yes, you're right. It is an issue. I mean, 22 tonnes is not especially heavy, but compared to containers of 8 to 10 tonne, I can see what you're saying.
Yeah. Yep. And
Okay.
sorry,
Go ahead, Peter.
one other thing was like LCL stuff. Like we've got some stuff coming out of Taiwan, and I mean the containers arrived in Tauranga on about the 14th of September.
Yeah,
and it still hasn't been unloaded.
Oh, it's outrageous, isn't it? I mean, to think it's come halfway around the world and you're still going to wait 2 weeks in Tauranga. But again, this is the issue of a huge amount of containers all arriving at the same time at the same place. Kiwi Rail being unable to cope with the volume. And we saw it about 12 months ago. I'm sure you remember those days as well, 2 weeks again. I've got most of my containers now being picked up and roaded up here, frankly, because this is the time of the year, and we'll prorata that cost amongst the importers if they're prepared to pay it, because there's not a lot of choice. You can come to Auckland. You've got a few options from your part of the world, Taiwan, etc., but not many. and those ships are full as well, right? So it's not a great situation. That LCL product, though, from around the world is super popular because those LCL containers, we call them FAKs, they get loaded ahead of most other commodities. So at least they get moved, hopefully, quicker.
Thank you.
Okay, I can't see Richard, Murray or Max. Okay, Alistair, I'll do you next. If Richard, Murray or Max has got a question, just please let me know now. Okay, we'll go to Alistair in that case and then to Kevin.
Yeah, Chris, a lot of this congestion has been driven by the increased demand of consumable products, as you mentioned. And I guess if you've got, the inelasticity of demand is a problem because, as soon as you get two more people that want something, it just slows the other 99 up. That increase in demand, that consumable demand, I assume that's kicked off since the printing of money and the COVID. How much of the baseline, if you want to call it that, say 2018 or 2019 baseline, has the consumables increased the load by?
The crazy thing is, depending which report you read and which economic newspaper you follow, the volume is only up 5% from 2018. It's a tiny amount of money, amount of increase, but it's because it's where it's going and all at the one place at the one time. It's a strange thing. If you look at certain modeling, if there were enough ships running around the world, we wouldn't really need more vessels to be built. But the fact they're stuck in places like Los Angeles, like Australia, like Asia, and not actually transiting across the ocean seems to be in part the reason we're having these issues. If everything was flowing freely, perhaps it would be a lot smoother. So demand, and even look at the Port of Tauranga, they've had 103 less vessel calls in the past 12 months, but handled around 8% more containers. It's just larger ships, less calls. But the percentages aren't that great, apart from the freight rates, of course, which have gone up some horrendous percentage. So it's an interesting problem. And the longer I go into it, the longer I think it's to do with congestion issues at those key ports, loading and unloading, that are causing the majority of these issues. In 2018, there were around 600 container vessels at anchor anywhere in the world not being used because there wasn't the demand for it. They're fully utilized now, but it's only around about a 5% increase, apparently.
Thanks, Chris. Let's go to Kevin.
Yes, what about the fast tracking of the Whangarei port and the proposed hub in Kumeu, which is already linked through to the hub in South Auckland? That would bypass all the traffic issues around Auckland City and open up a proper port with proper rail link. That seems to be a no-brainer to me.
It's an interesting thing about the port policy. This term, Michael would have said he's going to announce a decision on where the port will move to, whether it goes to Whangarei, whether some suggest it goes out to Onehunga. And I saw back about 5 or 6 years ago an interesting model for a floating port, sort of in the Firth of Thames, but not really, linking up with the rail hubs that are already existing in the Waikato. I think what industry really want, Kevin, is just a decision, even if it's a bad one, just to get on with it, rather than do another report at 30 odd million and still be no further advanced. I'd make one observation that in Auckland, around 80% of the containers that come across that port stay in the city. They don't get moved to other places. If we move the port to Whangarei, we have to do something well, and that is get the rail working properly. So that means larger, taller tunnels, the ability to carry hazmat goods on the rail, which you can't from Tauranga at the moment, and spend the money to do it properly like they have in other parts of the world. Those of you who've travelled to the States or Europe will see, for example, the rail wagons are double deckers. They carry 2 containers at once, not one as we do in this country. There's all those things to do properly, and I'm just not sure that we're prepared to commit the funds to make that happen.
Well, as I understand it, the rail link up to Whangarei has just this year been completed with all the bridges upgraded, the tunnels upgraded to take high cubes and proper weight containers or overweight containers, but it stops 21 kilometres short of the port. So they can't even use it.
Agreed. And I also think, Kevin, it's using old-fashioned thinking. Yes, it can carry high cube containers, but we're not talking like we would see overseas, where they're bigger wagons, taller wagons, that sort of stuff. We're still talking at that old-fashioned way of thinking, in my personal opinion. The rail part it's part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution, because you still need people to pick up the containers and take them from a railhead to people's premises and those sorts of things. Kiwi Rail's had a lot of money in the last 10 years, over 8 billion, I think the number sits at, but it's not the total solution. I personally think that, again, a personal view, that a hub through the Waikato makes more sense than a link up to Whangarei, but that's only because you've already got the infrastructure. You've got 2 inland ports, one owned by Ngāi Tahu and one owned by the Ports of Auckland in conjunction. Feeding that would seem to make more sense to me, but it won't be my decision, of course. Politics play a huge part in this at the end of the day.
And so long as the containers don't have to change train at Papakura, that will be very useful. Yeah. Peter, let's go to you. I think I saw your hand go up.
Just one of the other things regarding the Kumu railhead and linking through to South Auckland. The other problem they've got is unless they decide to put the Avondale line in through to Onehunga, they can't be running freight trains through the Newmarket because of the increased use of public transport once the rail link gets finished. So that's been my understanding is going to be another problem.
I think there's a practical consideration, Peter, too. So we're in the midst of building a large warehouse in Wiri at the moment because we want to take advantage of that Wiri, inland hub that the rail is meant to be feeding. But it hasn't worked yet properly for the last 2 or 3 years. It should be that the containers come off the vessel, are railed out to Wiri, we pick them up by trucks at night, no one gets affected, and we unpack the containers. That has not been the case for a couple of years yet. So even using the infrastructure we have got to make it work properly, to me, would be a good thing, rather than keep trying to do new things, perhaps.
Thanks, Peter. Daryl, and then Gordon.
Chris, you mentioned there's the actual capacity and what goods being moved is only increased by around 5%, but it's the fact that there's congestion at key ports around the world. And you touched on the fact that one of the big issues at Auckland is automation, but around the rest of the world, is that port congestion down to technology, or is it down to effects of COVID on employees, or what's the root sort of cause, or is there a common cause of that congestion?
I don't know there's a common cause. I think there's a number of causes leading to it. Let's just go back to the States for a moment, because it's forefront of my mind currently. So you've had an underinvestment in truck driving, and that's the same in the UK and Europe as well. Truck driving as a career hasn't been particularly glamorous, so there's a real shortage of drivers around the world. You've got an issue in America at the moment also around absenteeism at the ports. That is getting better, but yes, COVID, meaning that people not feeling well or concerned are not coming into work. And then you've got infrastructure issues in a lot of parts of the world, not so much Europe, but certainly in Asia. Vietnam would be a good example, and in the States as well. So infrastructure hasn't kept pace perhaps with what else has been going on. And if you dump a lot of containers and a lot of ships all at once, it just simply can't cope. In the West Coast in the States, they just opened a new port, actually. It's going to be handling around 3.5 million containers a year. So that's, you'd think, would make a significant difference to the problem, but it really can't get momentum quick enough, so it seems. I think, though, there's an underinvestment in a number of areas around the world that have led to these issues around congestion, whether it's hubbing vehicles, whether it's barges and those sorts of things. It hasn't really, people didn't think it was going to be a problem, and now it's caught up with us, and we are paying the piper, really.
Thank you, Chris. Any other questions from anybody? Gordon, yep.
Chris, it's all very well having a rail link, but when electricity or anything goes down, you also have to have a backup, being a road link. How do you actually make, for example, Whangarei work without a decent road?
I don't think you can. Personally speaking, again, a personal opinion, I think sometimes the narrative of rail is dominated too much when we really need a cohesive approach with road, rail and coast. And I guess rail has got a good, strong lobby group at government. You know, Kiwi Rail rocks down there, gets 8 billion in the last 10 years. But I've been to a number of forums with the road transport guys and that sort of stuff. And it does need a cohesive approach to the whole thing. Trucks are an important part, and the road, as you say, and the investment in roads, although I think that's going to change if Minister Wood is to be believed. But the investment in roads in the last 2 or 3 years has never been so low, I think. Even other things too, speed limits. I mean, if you notice how many speed limit changes have been around the country too, that affects the ability for trucks to deliver goods as well.
Yeah.
And I'd also make the argument, it might be a bit old-fashioned, but surely the roads into all our ports should be state highways. So they get the funding and the trucks can go in there, whether you go to Napier, for example, or Nelson. I mean, you're going through residential areas. Not the most useful way of delivering containers, perhaps.
All right. Any other questions? Chris, why are the Aussie stevedores going on strike?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's almost an annual question too, sadly. I'm not over all the aspects of why the union are having so many issues in Australia, but it seems demand for pay rises and that sort of thing comes around all the time. They're very strong, the Australian unions too. I mean, these rolling stoppages across all the ports in Australia will really significantly affect the ports. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but there is actually a private port in Australia now. It's owned by Hutchinson's in Sydney, a Hong Kong company. But even they've had problems with the union and problems with their ability to make the thing work properly. The unions have been on the go slow for a little while in Australia. They're slower to unload vessels than they probably should be as a way of ratcheting up the pressure. But well, what I did think was interesting today is that the Maritime Union of New Zealand aren't going out in sympathy either, which is good. That's a relief. Otherwise, it'd be even bigger problem than it currently could be.
Indeed. All right, last chance, guys, while Chris is here. Any questions for Chris? Okay. In that case, I'll invite Scott to close out the session, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Again, just the insights into your industry, your passion for what you're doing and how you're communicating it is just awesome to see. And it's just great having people like yourself out there keeping an eye on things and hopefully supporting us and the businesses we work with in the SME environment. So thank you very much for coming on and giving us some of your knowledge and thoughts. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Scott. I'm looking forward to the time when supply chain is no longer a subject and we sink back into the distance, into the shadows like we did for the 30 odd years before this. So that'd be great. Yes.
Thank you.
All right, Chris, again, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody that's come along and participated in this session. And we'll be running some more in the coming weeks. And so look out for some other engaging and interesting speakers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye. See you later.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris.